There are, broadly speaking, two schools of thought about reproduction parts. Some dislike the whole idea, feeling that they muddy the waters for conscious collectors. Others feel that many a model would have been saved from the bin utilising them, and that's surely a good thing, right? This difference of opinion seems to cross all of toy categories too, and it makes for interesting analysis. Dinky toy collectors have probably had reproduction parts available longer than any other diecast collector. Indeed, collectors of all the big three, Dinky, Corgi and Matchbox, along with even more obscure manufacturers, have a roster of bits and pieces to call on. One thing I've noticed across the board is that all parts available reproduction boxes are the most disliked. Given that there are only one or two makers who produce exceptional copies, that is somewhat surprising. Personally, I can see why some collectors would rather have a reproduction gift set box on display than having to pay out the king's ransom for a real one, and that's if one can be found. In the main, however, diecast collectors really don't mind most repo parts because many are reasonably distinguishable from the real thing. As we shall see, this is a very point that causes contention. One group that you could say has had its waters muddied is that of the vintage Action Man collector. Aside from the long-awaited reproduction gripping hands, the whole Repro figures and outfits have been regularly released upon the market. They are easy to spot if they're still in the nice new packaging, but not so easy if you're holding only a machine gun or a medal in his hand. In the last few years, I've wanted to purchase a couple of vintage figures from my youth, and it was very difficult to find completely authentic ones. Experience is everything here, and the reproduction items are so prevalent as to put off would-be collectors. There is one group who have a very vocal aversion to reproduction items, and it's the collectors of the vintage Star Wars items. Much of this could be down to the fact that the materials used in the originals, injection molded plastic, makes it relatively easy to reproduce high accurate copies of some rare accessories. In online forums, Star Wars collectors do not hold back in their dislike of all things repro, preferring originals every time. You may think this is being overprotective, but in truth, there are a lot of sharks circling them, willing to sell them reproductions as real. For tinplate collectors, spares available is patchy in both quality and quantity. You really do have to know your stuff in the first place, track down and even identify what you need. It's both surprising as to what you can't get as opposed to what you can get. For example, try finding quality pre-war rubber tyres for Triang Mimics, as it's probably easier to find wheels for an early Bing limousine. As such, collectors of tinplate tend to know exactly what is available due to the sheer research involved in the subject. Vintage model railways, due to their practical usage, have always required spare parts just to keep them running. Indeed, even in period there was a whole host of companies producing wheels, motors and such like for such a purpose. It's probably more unusual to find vintage railway items that have not had work done than those that have. It's viewed as a norm in vintage railway circles. It's also one of the few toy categories where professional restoration can add value to, say, a locomotive, particularly in the case of live steam. Lead figure collectors find themselves in a real conundrum when it comes to reproduction parts. On one hand, they can access a plethora of almost indistinguishable looking spare parts while running the risk of buying items utilising said parts. You can test paint etc. using ultraviolet light, but it takes the fun out of it somewhat. These are some of the hardest vintage toys to authenticate, and even seasoned collectors can get caught out with lead items. In this respect, many will only buy from respected dealers for this very reason. One of the things that struck me researching this was how supportive collectors are to one another regarding advice. On the website forums, There is an abundance of information available to help the collector either to access spares or to avoid the pitfalls involved in misrepresentation of items for sale. Personally, I think a lot of the spares industry gets a bad press. I've never seen anything pass off as original, but it only happens when you get into the hands of unscrupulous and unknowing third parties. I feel the spares industry answers a need and fulfills it admirably. A lot of craftsmanship and skill goes into the making of these spare parts, often by sole individuals striving to produce good products. In its purest form, it's about saving items and making the hobby accessible to all, which is not a bad thing. Now I've got to sit down and order the parts I forgot to put on my last order. How many times have I done that?